It's no secret that human beings have the tendency to look at the past with rose-tinted glasses. This is nothing new. You can observe it constantly. Although it's probably not as clear as to why people do that. Well, to my mind, it's because people live in the present, and thus being exposed to the present, they're only familiar with the travails and difficulties of the present. And even if they can abstractly grasp certain aspects of the past, such as the difficulty of, being a farmer in 1530, they can only grasp it in the abstract, which is to say, they're not really feeling it. But they do feel the things that happen in the present. A headache you have in the present is pretty bad. Or more recently, I had food poisoning, right? Now, there are all sorts of horrible ailments you could have experienced in the past that are quite rare now, but the only thing I can think of right now is the food poisoning that I'm recovering from. So there's that distortion, and there's also the point of comparison as well. People tend to look for the good things in the past and rarely for the bad things, which is kind of interesting because it's a bit of a paradox if you think about it. Because in the present, we tend to look at the bad things. We're always on the lookout for the bad news. If it bleeds, it leads is a phrase that's used in the newscaster business, right? Because anytime there's bad news, you want to make sure that you get on that so people can be aware of it. Newsworthy, for example, is not the fact that there are nice little puppies running around the park and that the kids are enjoying the company of the puppies. That's just not that interesting. No, you want to report that there's been some horrible accident on the bridge and the bridge collapsed and everyone passed away in the accident. So that's what's newsworthy, right? It's somewhat related to this. But when it comes to the past, interestingly enough, we tend to not look at the negative aspects. We don't look at the overwhelming presence of disease and all of these problems that occurred in the past. So years ago now, something like 10, 12 years ago, I needed an operation for an inguinal hernia. That's basically when your guts spill on over into your groin area. Given sufficient time, that sort of thing can actually kill you. Now, if I had been born in, the Roman Republic, then I probably would have died from that. And these are things that we just generally don't think about because gratitude is something I think that is very, very visceral, and it's felt in the present. It's difficult to feel that sense of gratitude with respect to the past. Anyway, why am I talking about this? Well, I'm talking about this because of our strange tendency to romanticize the past in terms of romance, right? Back before all these things happened, back before no-fault divorce, back before online dating, back before Tinder, back before the internet took us by storm and completely unraveled our lives. And we look back on that and say, oh, those were better times. Now, some people genuinely might feel that way, and some people have the unique skill of visualizing the past in a very visceral way that I simply can't. So, for example, I'm old enough to remember rotary phones, and I used rotary phones, but I can't really conjure up a vision of me physically manipulating the dial and rotating the rotary. So that's just not something I'm very good at. But the point I actually want to make here is related to the point I made at the beginning. The present feels visceral. The past is, by its very nature, distant. So we're much more willing to overlook the negatives of the past. More specifically, this notion that in the past romance was better, relationships between men and women were better, I think is a little bit farcical, in fact. Yes, it is absolutely true that Tinder and the internet and various legal intrusions, above all, no-fault divorce, have fundamentally changed many aspects of life between men and women. But the matter I take issue with is the false belief that a lot of men have, unfortunately, that romance itself and the romantic process, and of course, men and women's interactions in general, were just fundamentally better at a different point in time, at a juncture in time prior to the internet, at a juncture in time prior to the institutionalization of no-fault divorce, etc., etc. Yes, there's this persistent notion that that is absolutely true, but I want to take the time to challenge that a little bit. So one thing that is true is it used to be easier to get laid as an average guy. There's a question about that. But that's not really what people are talking about or reminiscing about or romanticizing, right? They're talking about the time when women loved men and men were men and all this. I think it's really a matter of visibility. It comes down to this issue of visibility because in today's day and age, online, something happens, right? You'll hear about it in an instant, right? You could live in Wichita, Kansas, or Bumble, wherever, and you'll hear about it, provided you have an internet connection. So you always have this visibility and audibility factor in front of you, and it always seems like the worst is happening, right? Because we're drawn to the worst things. Now, I present to you that, in fact, human nature hasn't changed much in the last couple of decades, or even a couple of hundred, or even thousands of years. So all the issues that men and women face, of course, have been arguably exacerbated by certain things that have come to pass. But it's not as if things were really rosy and amazing, peachy keen between men and women. I mean, for one thing, think about the fact that the largest divorce wave occurred just after, particularly in the United States, the institutionalization, the introduction of no-fault divorce. By Ronald Reagan, by the way. A lot of people like to praise Ronald Reagan. Well, he instituted no-fault divorce in California, and then it spread like wildfire throughout the country. So whatever you might think of Ronald Reagan, he really sucked in that respect. That said, in the 70s and 80s, you really saw a peak in divorce, mostly women obviously divorcing their men. Now, you can blame women for their nature of doing that, and I guess you could do that, yeah, sure. But the reality was that these women were all married for quite some period of time, and they didn't really enjoy it. What I'm trying to say is the institution itself was never as pristine as people like to present it to be, or having been. Men and women fought all the time. All these horrible stories you might read about involving things like abuse or what have you, all these things took place, right? Men and women never really got along. One of the key differences, of course, in the past is that men and women didn't really work very much together. They were living and leading separate lives. Yes, they'd get married and everything else was separate. They'd copulate to reproduce. Maybe they'd meet up once a day for an hour or two, and that was it. And all the things, the nasty things we associate with relationships, the cheating, the infidelity, on both sides, all of it, it all still took place. In fact, I venture to guess every one of us is the byproduct at some point in time of some unfaithful individual who was engaging in said activities, just as an example. So men and women never really got along, and there's always been that tension because of the differences between men and women. They are different. Just as there is intrasexual competition, there's a kind of intersexual competition, although it has a completely different basis. And people romanticize these things. They might have an example. For example, I know that the Lord of Ireland, the scion of the slayer of tax dragons, and the seed of Cuchulainn, that guy Pete you refused to invite to gatherings, has talked about the stability of the marriage of his parents that he grew up in, and he's a fair bit younger than I am. I don't remember that. I remember a lot of fighting between my parents, right? And I'm pretty old. I'm pushing 50. So I think things were a lot less pleasant than people imagine them to be. Now, you could make the argument, of course, well, that might be true, but at least women couldn't divorce men. At least they couldn't do this. At least it wasn't visible. There you go. It wasn't visible. Yes, that's right. It was all hidden behind closed doors. All these many secrets, right? And there were many secrets. You ever watch that show that reveals the roots of celebrities, and George R.R. Martin, the author, came on there and turned out that his grandfather was in fact not really his grandfather? Well, there you go. These things happen behind closed doors. It was a lot less public, right? But in the 60s and the 1900s, all these things were happening, right? Behind closed doors. People weren't talking about it. Now, you can make the argument, as I said, yeah, it was better. At least it wasn't visible. At least people weren't thinking about it. At least they were trying to hide it. Therefore, it would be less destructive. I suppose so. But let me make a point here that might seem a bit rare for a manospherean context. But whether man or woman, let's say you're in a legitimately horrible relationship, i.e. marriage, and there's no way to extricate yourself from it. No way. You're stuck there. That is a negative in some sense. Now, I'm not saying that the reason why 70% plus of marriages globally, yeah, they end by divorce initiated by women, that all these marriages are those situations. In fact, I think most of them aren't. But even so, you could be in that situation. Things weren't necessarily better back then. And the challenges now are different, but I think we'd always be wise to remember that human nature is relatively static, and we haven't changed that much. It's just our environment and the technology that's changed us. So everything's more visible. But men and women were still fighting and hating each other back in the day, not getting along, being upset about things, as has always been the case. That's nothing new. People pretend that along came feminism and everything changed. Yes, some things changed quite a bit, but a lot of the nastiest of the nasty stuff was still happening behind closed doors. And people were miserable behind closed doors, right? So it's very easy, and I've talked about this over the years, to present feminism as the ultimate boogeyman, when in reality, much of it just comes down to human nature. Feminism has interfered, you could argue, with human nature, particularly women. But do I think it's as much as a boogeyman as people believe it is? No, not really. Men and women never really got along. Men and women have been forced to get along because they need each other for reproduction. And everything that has resulted from that necessity has been a compromise. Two fundamentally different types of human beings, men and women, having to, quote unquote, cooperate. And when the environment was different, when it was a lot harsher, yeah, they were forced to cooperate in a way that they're not forced to now. But it doesn't mean that they liked each other or they really got along or any of that stuff. Some of them did, sure, just like some of them do these days, but a lot of them didn't. Men and women just don't get along for the most part, right? It's just the way it is. So whilst it is true that we can't viscerally feel the past, and therefore we cannot truly internalize it, at the same time we should at least bear in mind that whatever challenges we're facing these days, particularly in the so-called romantic sphere between men and women, some of them are different, but a lot of them are the same old, right? Based simply on the fact that men and women are radically different creatures. Anyways, thank you for tuning in. Please hit the notification, by the way, because I have this sense that a lot of people are not getting notifications from my videos. So if you could double check that, make sure you're getting the notification by hitting that notification bell would be appreciated. And yeah, the rest of the YouTube jazz, comment, subscribe, share, yada yada, really does help out the channel. And if I am still alive, I'll check you out later. Take care. May the gods watch over you. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.